Okay. Um, all right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our speakers and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the globe. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by the Asia Freedom Institute, a nonprofit organization that promotes democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, and I'm the moderator for today's discussion, which will delve into the complexities surrounding China's human rights record as scrutinized in the latest Universal Periodic Review held in Geneva. We will talk about China's approach in the UN Human Rights Council and if the UPR session that is occurring approximately 5 years actually making a difference. And to speak on this topic, I'm so glad to be sharing the screen with eminent speakers. We have Peter Irwin, Associate Director for Research and Advocacy at Uyghur Human Rights Council. We have Carmen Lau, for International Advocacy and Program Associate at Hong Kong Democracy Council. And we have Mandy McKeown, Executive Director of International Tibet Network. And unfortunately, we don't have Ramona Lee, the senior researcher and advocate at Chinese Human Rights Defenders right now, but I really hope she can make it anytime soon for today's discussion. Um, yeah, so a very warm welcome to our dear panelists to AFI's discussion. And I would like to run you through the agenda for today's discussion. So initially, we will be starting off with two general questions intended for all our speakers. After that, we will go on with three individual questions, and again, we will have two general questions at the end. And for all, our speakers will have 3 minutes to give your answers. And we will be starting off with Peter, followed by Mandy and Carmen. Okay, so without further ado, I'll start with the first general questions. And I have kept the introduction of our speakers short so that we can make more room for our discussion today. And if you want to get the full bio of our speakers, then you can always go to Asia Freedom Institute's website, where you can have the access to the full bio of our speakers today. Okay, so Peter, the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, by the Human Rights Council is a process that happens about every 5 years to check the human rights situation in every country by the international community. China's human rights record were recently reviewed for the fourth time under this process. Peter, how important is the UPR process for your respective organizations? Can you explain how your organizations prepare for this review, including what you do in the months before it starts, the information that you gather and submit, attending in the Geneva session, what happens afterward, and how you use the data and the materials you collect with other UN mechanisms and platforms? Over to you, Peter.
Thanks a lot for the question. Thanks for having me. In terms of kind of the way in which our organization approaches the review, I think we see it in the larger context of UN reviews. So the UPR, I think some might say, is a little bit more of a political review, involves, of course, member states. And in some ways it can replicate, especially in the case of China, it can replicate some of the divisions that exist in the Human Rights Council. Not all of them. I think there, of course, is space for some member states, which we can speak about, to be making recommendations that might not align completely with the kind of voting patterns you might see in the council. So what I would say is that the UPR is a useful process. It's an opportunity to point attention at the human rights record of China in this case, or other countries. But I think, again, it needs to be seen within or in amongst other human rights bodies within the system, right? You have independent experts, treaty bodies, and other review processes that are more clearly sort of independent, and I think can put more pressure on the government. But at the same time, I think it's important that we engage with every human rights review or every process within the UN system, especially when it comes to China, just because we have not so many opportunities to do so and to point this kind of focus on the government. And I think in some ways too, I think the process itself is, which we can speak about, is more easy for the Chinese government to influence. They we've seen that they've been doing a lot of work, and they have done a lot of work ahead of the review, but also throughout the year in trying to influence other member states to make positive reviews during the UPR. In terms of the kind of approach we take, I was at the previous review in 2018, and colleagues were at the reviews before that. UHRP and other Uyghur organizations have made submissions, for example, gotten together and compiled information. I think this is important because you can track changes in what's been happening on the ground in the country. And for us in East Turkestan, I think this review is also important because it allows us to look from 2017 to 2023 or so, where you see this real deterioration in terms of human rights conditions on the ground for Uyghurs. So that allows us to submit information that really tracks these kinds of changes, and also pull in a lot of UN language and recommendations that have come up over the past 5 years. Just looking through the UN compilation and looking back towards every single recommendation, every single human rights process, there's really no dearth of information on the situation from UN bodies, whether it's on the Uyghur situation or in Tibet or in Hong Kong or elsewhere. There's a lot of review processes that have put forward a lot of real concrete, effective recommendations that we can ground our reporting in. One just strategic approach we take is, okay, we of course submit information on cases and information in terms of what's happening, but we also try to submit information, make recommendations, and push governments to make recommendations on things like access for UN special procedures, access for experts, cooperation with the UN system, to ensure that that's a sort of a space where we can put a little bit more pressure on the government and show and demonstrate that they're not actually cooperating with the system or accepting access for UN experts. We also made some recommendations and added information in a report about pushing the government to release disaggregated data. Now, this sounds a little bit in the weeds, that like, why would you be pressing for disaggregated data? But I think that is a realistic thing to ask the government for, because it really inhibits us from reporting on the situation in the Uyghur region, for example, when it comes to whether it's, falls in birth rates or forced labor. Prison numbers disaggregated by data can show us, disaggregated by ethnicity can show us how there's discrepancies in terms of like sentencing rates and things. So I think that's a realistic ask. And in some ways it allows you then to push the government to, which we would expect them to respond and say, well, we're not going to give you that data, to say, well, look, they're clearly not operating in good faith with the system. So again, I think there's some ways in which you can use the UPR for your advantage. And I think it's not, it is useful in some ways, but also there are shortcomings of it as well. And then, of course, showing up at the review itself and having demonstrations, the broken chair outside of the sessions, for example, shows that the communities are there. And again, we had a big demonstration, I remember, in 2018 with Uyghur and Tibetan and Hong Kong groups, and it allowed us to show our sort of strength outside the review process and demonstrate that we're watching it very closely. So I think that strategically, there's some definite reasons why there's a need to be there and to be working at the review.
Thank you so much, Peter, for giving us a really good start for today's discussion. Let's move on to Mandy. Mandy, let's hear your perspective on this.
Hi, thank you. I echo everything Peter said. We've worked very closely together over a number of the UPR sessions over the last kind of decade now. And obviously, some of China's most egregious human rights offences are committed in Tibet as a result of the 7-decade-long occupation. So we put a lot of emphasis, our organisation puts a lot of emphasis on the UPR as a mechanism, because we do see it as a really unique opportunity for us to encourage global Tibet groups to focus attention on the situation in Tibet. And really, we do this in a number of different ways. So firstly, it's encouraging governments to have some of their own accountability, to hold China accountable by ensuring that they do make these strong recommendations. So states aren't the experts. And the UPR isn't an expert review, it is a peer-to-peer review. So it's a really good opportunity for governments to be able to step up and ensure that they are raising the most major concerns that China is abusing. And we think that this really brings a lot of leverage. It enables us to gauge the different issues that the international community is raising, and it enables us to kind of further press for China to be held more accountable. So that's kind of like a really first point that we use. But secondly, for us, for International Tibet Network, this is an opportunity for us to really bring global Tibet groups together to help to develop their advocacy knowledge and their advocacy skills, for Tibet groups across the globe to really understand the process that is needed to press governments to really spotlight the concerns that we need to be raised. So we do use this as a really strong capacity building process to help really skill up Tibetans and Tibet advocates around the world. And thirdly, China is increasingly trying to silence its critics, particularly in the UN Human Rights Council Forum. So it's another opportunity for us to make sure that voices are heard and voices are raised, and the silencing is not allowed. And that helps to be a reminder to Tibetans, both in exile but also inside Tibet, that they're not forgotten, that Tibet is still a serious issue, and it is an issue that is being worked on, and the international community is going to stand up against China and take action. So there are kind of three major areas that we use when we're working at the UPR or within the UPR mechanism. And how we develop this engagement. So like I said earlier, we've worked in the UPR forum for the last 3 or 4 series, and we obviously start the process by developing a really strong submission, and this time there were at least 3 Tibet-specific submissions. So one from ICT, one from Tibet Advocacy Coalition, and then TWA and the Geneva Bureau also put forward a really strong submission. So we work, making sure that there are really good pieces of evidence pulled together with strong recommendations. And then, for the network and for the advocacy coalition, our focus really is twofold once the submission has been put forward. So like I say, we support building the capacity of Tibet groups around the world. So we offer skills, we offer tools, we help to develop coordinated advocacy with groups in capitals so that they can press for advanced questions ahead of time. They can advocate for strong Tibet-specific recommendations, and they really understand the process and what it takes to be able to make sure that the UPR can be used as a really good, solid mechanism to talk about the situation in Tibet. But we also work really very much in coordination with our allies and with other Tibet groups. So we had a really strong concerted effort in Geneva this time, working with our other Tibet group allies. Undertaking joint briefings, working in the pre-session, feeding into the process to make sure that we have joined up coordinated messaging, but also working really strongly with Hong Kongers, with Uyghurs, with Southern Mongolian colleagues of ours to make sure that we're all working as hard together to ensure that China really is put under the spotlight during this kind of really crucial time. So there are main areas that we work on during this process.
Thank you so much, Mandy, for walking us through the process and telling us about your efforts for this UPR session, and also mentioning about China's strategy and the influence in silencing the Human Rights Council. Now let's move on to Carmen. Carmen, let's hear your perspective on this.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. HADC, oh, well, it's been the first time of HADC engaging the UPR session in 2023. Sorry, this year, because apparently there's a lot of crackdowns on civil society happened in Hong Kong since 2018, the last UPR cycle, and a lot of us, including myself, actually fled Hong Kong after that, after 2019. So it's really interesting that it's not quite interesting, but interesting in a way that we used to advocate in the UN or in UN mechanisms from inside Hong Kong. I used to be a politicians and advocate on behalf of my political party in the UN, but then is somehow things changes so quickly that many of us have to flee Hong Kong and establish new organizations to continue our international advocacy. So HADC born after these sort all of the human rights crackdowns happened, and that is why it is new to the organization for engaging in any of the UN mechanisms. And but at the same time, because HADC is rather small and with limited resources, so we do utilize our previous, for example, research efforts or results to consolidate some kind of reports or briefings, in particular for this UPR review session. And for example, we in 2021, we've published a Hong Kong political prisoner report, and it happened amid of the crackdown after the national security law, and we updated it day by day until now. So we utilize this kind of data to demonstrate from the number of political prisoners increasing to demonstrate how the authorities, including the Hong Kong government and also the PRC government, conducting in Hong Kong, violating human rights in Hong Kong. And and at the same time, we also used previous information that happen to be open resources that we could find online from many of the now dismantled organizations. I'm not sure if you understand this, because it's, well, for even in such a free space we have for now, we still, we are really aware of this kind of like possibly being regarded as still having connections with civil society organizations back in Hong Kong. So we use open resources that we could take online, that may be archived by some anonymous people on the internet, that's related to, like, for example, Hong Kong advocacy in the UN in the past. And also, of course, we will utilize recommendations that's been made by treaty bodies, or, for example, statements that's been issued by the OSCHR or the UN High Commissioner. And one example would be really obvious, that during this UPR session, when we do advocacy, we take the recommendation that's been made by the ICC, the Human Rights Committee, in 2022, to call for repeal of the national security law, where the national security law is actually the source of human rights crackdown in Hong Kong came from recently. So apparently we target the national security law when we do the advocacy in this cycle. And because in the ICCPR reviewing session for Hong Kong, the Human Rights Committee made a really strong recommendation to call for repeal for the national security law as well. So we take this as a really strong example to lobby the member states to try to include these recommendation in the exact wording or maybe in a more subtle way to shine a light on the national security law in Hong Kong. I think the Hong Kong case is quite special or unique because historical reason, although China is not does not ratify the ICCPR, but then Hong Kong is one of the region that ratified the ICCPR and also the CESCR, the sister. So and it's by law in Hong Kong in our mini constitution that civil rights and political rights are protected under the ICCPR for Hong Kongers. So it's quite a good opportunity or points that we always stressed to the member states where Hong Kong actually are conducting human rights violations that are not compelled to the ICCPR in particular. So like the Hong Kong diaspora or us, the organizations which are born after 2019 are still in the learning curve for UN advocacy. But then we always learn from like organizations including UHRP and also ITN for the efforts of doing UN advocacy.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for letting us know about the emergence of HKTC. HKTC might be a new organization, and you are saying that it's a small organization, but the work done by the members of HKTC are commendable. And you were talking to us about the sleepless nights that you had to go through. So yeah, HKTC is doing a really good job. Thank you so much, Mandy. Now we are moving forward with our second general question. We'll start with Peter again. So China initially resisted the formation of the Human Rights Council in 2006. However, since then, its approach has evolved from a passive and defensive stance to a more activist role in the council. The International Service for Human Rights scored the 17 countries running for the 15 seats in the Human Rights Council in 2023. So China fulfilled only 2 out of the 16 criteria for membership, right? But despite this, China still received 154 votes and is now serving its 6th term as a member of the council. I'd like to know your perspective of China's approach in the Human Rights Council. How much tangible evidence do we have of Chinese government's pressure on other member states in the Council, and how can more evidence be collected? What can the human rights community do to encourage new members in the Human Rights Council, members who will really stick to the human rights standards and rules that were agreed upon when the Council was first formed? Peter, the screen is yours.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. China, generally speaking, has tried really hard to reframe the debate on human rights or what human rights are within the system, like broadly speaking. They emphasize things like state sovereignty, territorial integrity, that these are internal matters that should not be the concern of the international community, should not be the concern of human rights experts, for example, should not be the concern of the UN. So what they try to do is reframe issues, not in human rights terms, but in terms of things like in the Uyghur region, terrorism or counterterrorism, stability maintenance, and things like this. So their perspective has been one to undermine the human rights system in general, undermine a system which is sort of aimed or like supposedly aimed at actually holding states accountable. China does not want to be held accountable, and they take a lot of steps to try to undermine that system itself. They try to make it to sort of work the system into one that is more like a state-to-state approach, so that like bilateral relationships are the most important thing. That we can have these conversations bilaterally, but this should not be something that should be raised, or human rights issues should not be raised within the UN system or at the Human Rights Council. They quite often oppose any kind of efforts within the Human Rights Council. If you look at the voting patterns on resolutions or look at joint statements, they routinely oppose efforts at the council to hold states responsible for human rights violations. They do this because they understand that they might be targeted themselves, and they are targeted themselves. Beyond that, they also, how do they actually work within the system to sort of tamp down any kind of criticism when it comes to human rights activists? What they harass and intimidate not only human rights defenders, but they also harass and intimidate and threaten in the language you see at the council too, or in statements during treaty body reviews, UN human rights experts and staff. And we don't really see this very much from other member states. They actually go pretty far in criticizing quite strongly the work of human rights experts, which the system has supported and the system has voted in and appointed. And if you look at the UPR in particular, you see that they don't actually allow engagement with UN mechanisms. They don't do consultation broadly with civil society in China to the extent that it actually exists. I mean, there are no Uyghur civil society organizations or Tibetan civil society organizations that are actually able to work with the Chinese government, obviously. So it's an indication that the only groups that are submitting critical information are those that are outside the country. And that's a clear indication of the fact that there's no space for civil society. You see in 2018, for example, there was a case where when I was working at the World Uyghur Congress, we had submitted information for the review. And then we found out that there was pressure within the system, within the Secretariat and the Office of the High Commissioner from the Chinese government to have reports removed from the system. Our report was removed, and the justification was that supposedly that we're a separatist organization, and the information should not be allowed to be considered for the stakeholder summary, so the compilation of information from civil society before the review process. Right, so they really make efforts to basically remove information or pressure the UN human rights system through the Human Rights Office to not accept information from critical organizations. The information ended up in the end being re-added to the system, but it was too late because it was already stripped from the summary of stakeholder information. And there was a big back and forth. There was a big joint statement, I think, with a number of organizations. Just pointing out the fact that this happened, right? So this shows you that there's this intimidation and harassment, and also work sort of behind closed doors within spaces in Geneva to stop organizations like ours or my previous organization from having information allowed to be considered. You also saw reporting this year about China putting pressure on UN, putting pressure on member states. I think Reuters had a piece a couple days before the review itself, showing that there was a lot more pressure, and you had diplomats speaking anonymously to the journalists about this. Again, I think Carmen pointed out cases where like Hong Kong organizations just aren't able to submit information for consideration too, because there's just these kinds of restrictions, intimidation, and harassment of civil society who might want to engage with the system. And I might also note that last week was I believe it's the 10-year anniversary of the death of Chao Shunli, who was a Chinese human rights defender who wanted to travel to Geneva. She was stopped at the airport. She was basically put into detention, and she died, I believe, a few weeks later. Right. So this is a signal for human rights defenders who want to engage with the system that this could happen to you if this is what you want to do as well. In terms of how much tangible evidence we have of this kind of pressure, well, we see it, right? And we hear it from diplomats, and we hear it anonymously from diplomats. And you also see it in the kind of language that you get that gets replicated within statements from other governments. It sounds eerily similar to what the Chinese government has been saying, and you hear it from the mouths of diplomats who are often working in alignment with the Chinese government. And what can we be doing in terms of like our approach to encourage new members to the Human Rights Council? I think that's a good point. I think if you look at the election last year, China was running on a closed slate. There was only, I think there were 2 seats in the Asia Pacific region that were open, and China took one of the seats, and I forget which other one took the seat, but there was no actual, there was no other government actually running for that seat. So China was guaranteed whether they got the votes or not to have that seat. So an easy thing, I think we would need to encourage other member states to run for these seats, right? That it needs to be a competitive process when China has been shown to be clearly not participating or cooperating with the system at all. Other governments need to run, and other governments need to be supported by the Human Rights Council and the UN system for those seats. And then how can we actually encourage membership or members of the council also to be able to discuss these issues? One approach we've taken as well is to find the issues that resonate with different countries. While maybe a government might not be willing to support a resolution to discuss the High Commissioner's assessment on the Uyghur region that came out a year and a half ago, but can we find issues like cultural heritage or language rights or things that might be more palatable for member states to be able to speak and to be able to vote for resolutions or joint statements? At the same time, we don't want to give states a pass to not support resolutions or not support statements that the Human Rights Office has said in the Uyghur region that there's crimes against humanity that may be happening. I don't think we don't want to allow them to say we can only support something that talks about cultural heritage or language rights or whatever else. We want to be pushing for them to be supporting these resolutions, but I think there are ways in which, and you see this through the UPR, there are ways in which other countries can find their voice in a way to be able to make strong recommendations that might not be specifically related to something that we might want to be raised, but find these sort of alternative paths that put additional pressure on the government. So again, I think the Chinese government's been very effective in terms of their sort of war against the system and trying to reframe the system, but I think there are some options we still have to try to push back, and I think all our organizations have been pushing back reasonably effectively, but we do need support from governments still.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for sharing with us your experience that you had in the 2018 UPR session, and we shall delve into more such experiences in a later discussion. So, Mandy, let's hear your perspective on this.
Thank you, and thanks, Peter, for that really good overview of the situation. As Peter said, China worked really hard to not be held accountable within the UN system, which shows us the importance that they also give to it as a way for them to be able to be seen to be adhering to human rights. So that's a really interesting point for us to always remember, that despite everything that they say, they do see them being promoted as good human rights representatives within the forum as something that they really want, and they want to be seen to be being perceived as adhering to everything that they are supposed to. One of the key tactics that they use, as Peter raised, is the targeting and harassing of those that do attempt to call China out at the Human Rights Council. From 2010 to 2020, the UN have reported that China accounted to be the fourth largest state to be having reprisals, making reprisals. They were listed amongst the 11 top countries for engaging in patterns of reprisal against those who were trying to call out what is happening under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. For the UPR specifically, so the UPR in January, we know that China brought a huge delegation, where under the understanding there were at least 60 delegates who were brought in to Geneva during that period. And that itself was an intimidating experience. Pete and I both witnessed this with our own eyes, trying to enter the UPR, and how our Tibetan and Uyghur and Hong Konger colleagues were really intimidated very seriously during that period. It's especially worrying for the Tibetan, Uyghur, Hong Konger colleagues of ours who have family back home. So understanding that these reprisals, sorry, my cat's joined us, that these reprisals are very, very serious and have massive repercussions. But also, as Pete says, prior to the opening of the session, we received a very, very serious notice that the Beijing Permanent Mission in Geneva had requested to the Office of the High Commissioner that no, and this is their phrase, no anti-China separatists should be granted access to the UPR. And they went on to say that they wanted the Office of the High Commissioner to ensure that activists did not scale fences and did not hold up banners and did not issue any slogans which would go against China's standing at the Human Rights Council. These are really serious tactics that China are allowed, unfortunately, to use during this forum, during the Human Rights Council, and we rely very heavily on the Office of the High Commissioner to make sure that they are always held to account for this, and we're really glad to see that they do take this seriously, and we hope that they do continue to do that. What the rest of the community can do, so governments can obviously continue to talk about this, can continue to talk about any transnational repression that there is, which we've seen very widespread. Governments need to continue to not shy away from their own responsibility to hold China accountable. And when it comes to China having a seat on the Human Rights Council, as Pete said, some kind of system really needs to be put into place to ensure that there is a more competitive standing, so that governments can use their votes to actually stop China having a seat, as opposed to the situation that we have now, where if nobody is standing against China, then they are automatically elected to the council, and they are one of the world's biggest human rights abusers. So we certainly should not see them have that seat and be sitting on the council.
Thank you so much, Mandy, for sharing with us this really interesting experience that you had. And moving on to Carmen, let's hear your perspective on this.
Undoubtedly China's influence is really powerful, at least within the Human Rights Council. In the past weeks, there was a legislative counselor from Hong Kong who is pro-Beijing called Jonas Ho. He spoke at the Human Rights Council, accusing that human rights activists or protesters in Hong Kong in 2019 are actually violating human rights and, destroying others' rights. This is a really good example on how China or the Hong Kong government they are trying to create a new narrative on the history or the stories that happened inside the oppressed region, and undoubtedly Hong Kong is just one of the case, and we've been, well, unfortunately, we do not have much to do inside Hong Kong for now, especially after the passage of Article 23, which is an escalated version homegrown national security bill in Hong Kong, passed yesterday. And I could assume that it will be more and more silence voices in Hong Kong instead of, working other way around. But then we are in the Hong Kong community, we are taking the opportunity that many excelled to any corner of the world, every corner of the world. And we have Hong Kongers or activists or perhaps may only be people who still wanted to voice out for Hong Kong even though they are now exiled. They're now in exile, and so it seems to the Hong Kong community that the narrative being spoken inside the UN or within the UN mechanisms are different from the rest of the world. Like to us, like Geneva is a identical sphere that narrative could be easily manipulated by China. And that's why we take the opportunities of having diaspora around the world, especially in traditional Western countries or democratic countries. We engage not only in Geneva, but also in the capitals in order to try to spread our narrative, the correct version of the history, and try not to, letting China to dominate the voices within the UN. Because just using back the Junius Ho as an example, he is one of the human rights abusers who has been really outspoken and whose voice he always make nonsense speeches or statements in Hong Kong and accusing people that's not even pro-democratic, but maybe people who are in his camp. He's just one of the extreme example that we think he shouldn't be allowed to speak in a space which embrace human rights and these kind of universal values. And we, as for example, like HKDC, we not only do we don't only focus on UN advocacy, but also advocacy in, for example, Washington DC, and also we do community work as well. So for now we are trying to think of some creative way to continue not only advocacy in the UN, but also the Hong Kong democracy movement as a whole. So we, like HADC, we do believe that building bridges among different stakeholders or sphere could really help building up our narrative, and also could really help with advocating for our cause. So for now, unfortunately, China is elected again into the Human Rights Council, but I do believe that diaspora activists, Hong Kong activists around the world, we will make progress in before the next elections.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Now we will move on to the individual questions. So we'll start with Peter again. So Peter, you've mentioned about one of the experiences that you had in 2018 UPR session, and a clear example of China using its influence in the Human Rights Council was its reaction to a UN report in August 2022 about human rights in the Uyghur region released by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So initially, China tried to bury the document. Then, using its diplomatic and financial power, it successfully stopped a discussion at the Human Rights Council about the report, which concluded that China might be committing crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. How is the Uyghur community working to ensure China is held accountable for these actions? What issues did you prioritize in your advocacy efforts for the recent UPR session? And what are the positive takeaways for the Uyghur community? Peter.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, well, to make a couple points from the beginning about the way in which this report was released. The UN Human Rights Office started gathering information at least a year before the report was released. I think maybe a year and a half before that. And you see that there was a lot of government pressure for the report to be basically thrown in the trash and not released at all. There was reporting showing that the Chinese mission literally threatened to disengage with the High Commissioner's office if the report was released. This is the level, this is the extent to which they were trying to threaten the office. In the end, the report was released, and they didn't disengage with the office. And I think that's actually a really important point to make. And Mandy made this point as well, that I think the Chinese government cares a lot about how they're perceived within the UN system. I think people often think that they're just there to make their points and go home. No, they actually really care about how they're spoken about. And you see this in terms like the responses they make to treaty bodies or to the High Commissioner's statements or to government statements about them. They put a lot of work into this. They send huge delegations for the review. They try to frame what's happening in these regions of the country as well. This is not about human rights. We look at all the great things we're doing. They put on side events. They promote the events and promote the participation for gongos, government organized NGOs, to go and basically tell the government line on these kinds of issues. So I think we really need to not underestimate, and I think this is underestimated in terms of the Human Rights Office, sometimes underestimated in terms of member states, that we think that we got to be really careful with how we treat China or not criticize them too much, or they might disengage with the system. Well, a clear example of this is that they actually continue to engage with this system after the High Commissioner's report was released, because they understand that it's important for them to be there and make their points. So I think I would say that firstly. What can we do sort of post-report release? You know, it's been about 1.5 years, almost 2 years since this very important assessment was released. The assessment was really important because it included interviews with Uyghur survivors, I think over 50. You know, they used primary sources, they used Chinese government documents. This assessment really verified a lot of the reports and vindicated all of the groups who had been submitting information for the years previous. It verified a lot of the stuff that was being submitted. It's a very robust report. I think there needs to be a lot more pressure on the High Commissioner himself and their office to ensure that there's actually a follow-up, that the report itself is being raised at every single Human Rights Council session in the oral statement from the High Commissioner. There needs to be updated information. There needs to be briefings from states. You know, there was a resolution to discuss the report. It was voted down very narrowly, unfortunately, but I think there needs to be more of a push from the High Commissioner's office to ensure that they own the report and they're going to continue to speak about it. The report says that crimes against humanity may be happening in the Uyghur region. This is the most serious allegation ever leveled against China by any UN body, right? So this needs to be taken very seriously and followed up. One concern we had is that the UN compilation report for the UPR itself did not include the language of crimes against humanity, which we were a little bit concerned with. It does include reference to the report, the assessment, but it does not use the language of crimes against humanity, which is a bit concerning. Right? If that kind of language is being used by the High Commissioner's office, it should absolutely be part of this compilation report before the UPR. I think in terms of like positives, what do we see during the UPR and what can we expect going forward? I think there were some definite positives in terms of seeing governments like, not just, Western European countries or the US or Canada or Australia or these countries bring forward strong recommendations. So for access, I talk a lot about like pushing for recommendations and pushing the Chinese government for access for UN experts. You see governments like Peru and Paraguay, Mexico, Argentina, the Bahamas making strong recommendations for China to consider or to accept visits specifically from UN experts. That's really great to see, because I think that's really something that we should be pushing on, that there needs to be access for experts to be on the ground to report on violations. I mean, China, of course, doesn't accept these requests, and that's something we point to as well. There's dozens of open requests, outstanding requests for access, and China just says no to all of them. And again, it gives you an indication that the Chinese government is not really interested in having actual cooperation with the system. They want to be perceived as cooperating with the system. And also on a few other positive notes as well, we see other countries outside of what sort of different coalitions of states at the UN. So we have Mexico and Ecuador who made recommendations related to business and human rights. That's relevant in the context of forced labor in the Uyghur region and overseas business activity. Iraq made a recommendation for China to protect antiquities and cultural heritage, which is really important. And Iraq, of course, has a reason to make that recommendation, but that's really important in the context, certainly of Tibet and the Uyghur region and East Turkistan. Costa Rica on biometric data, that China should have to establish norms on the use of biometric data. Again, that's very important in Tibet and the Uyghur region. You have Chile and Mexico and Iceland making recommendations about reproductive rights of women. And this is a possible reference to the dramatic falls in birth rates in the Uyghur region, to the push at the local level and the regional level for birth control and birth prevention policies for sterilizations. And then you also have Mongolia, for example, making a recommendation on China to protect and promote cultural diversity. Again, not the strongest recommendation we would like to see, but I think that really helps us diversify the states who are speaking about these issues, perhaps from their own perspective. There's our Southern Mongolian colleagues have been speaking in different places about the effects on like the language and the school system for Southern Mongolia. So again, the point I'm trying to make is that there are avenues in which we can continue to approach these issues from different angles, I suppose. And there's lots of countries who are speaking about issues that I think we should be taking up. But maybe I'll stop there. But I think there were some positives that came out of this review, and there's some things that we can follow up on in the months to come.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing with us your perspective. The next question is for Mandy. Mandy, how did the Tibetan organizations involved in the recent UPR work together? And did you do anything different as compared to the 2018 session? What issues did you prioritize in your advocacy work for the recent UPR session? And same, what are the positive takeaways for the Tibetan community? The screen is yours, Mandy.
Thank you. So in relation to what we did differently, so in all honesty, our approach didn't really change that dramatically. The change really is the response rate from Tibet groups. So Tibet groups in a global sense, so from New Zealand all the way around to Mexico, you know, Tibet groups became much more engaged this time than we've seen before. You know, there was more commitment to ensuring that they were taking part in the coordinated effort, more commitment to holding advocacy meetings with foreign ministries in capitals. And this kind of increased engagement definitely helped to lead to not just the usual suspects, as Pete has already referenced, you know, not just the usual Western governments raising the issues that are so important with the linked recommendations. So that's the biggest difference. You know, our emphasis, as I said earlier, really has been on building the skills and capacity for Tibetans and Tibet group representatives in capitals to ensure that, you know, this linking up of advocacy work from Geneva with the permanent missions goes back to the capitals, and then there's the link to make sure that that the right information is being fed into the system so that we could really see the results that we've got. You know, I think for the community, the Tibetan freedom movement community, this has been a really inspiring process this time round. You know, we saw a twofold increase in the amount of Tibet-specific recommendations, which is a huge amount of growth. You know, I think this growth has definitely linked to the change of the political landscape. You know, the political landscape now in 2024 is very, very different from what it was in 2018. And this has obviously been of huge benefit to us and to all of our movements when it comes to the UPR, because states are more comfortable to speak up, more comfortable to raise the issues that they weren't necessarily as comfortable to raise back in 2018. So this is definitely something which is a change, and something that we are you know, working really hard to ensure that they maintain this level, and they maintain this level of standing up and speaking out. You know, amongst the government recommendations, we saw Tibet being raised on ending the residential boarding school system, an end to forced labour, an end to coercive labour transfer in Tibet. We saw states raising Tibetan language rights, education, cultural rights, freedom of religion and expression, cultural rights, and we also saw, which is something which we have been really calling for, which is access. So access to Tibet. You know, Pete spoke about the High Commissioner's visit and the report from a few years ago. So when the High Commissioner went to China, there was no request even to go to Tibet. So we are really pressing for the current High Commissioner to be given access, but also special procedures. So we were really buoyed to see so many states calling for that, and pressing for that to happen. Yeah, I mean, I think as I said, for the Tibetan community, for the Tibetan freedom movement, I think this experience has really shown that by us working in a coordinated way and as having joined up plans as a movement, we can really see an increase in activity for Tibet, and we you know, the feedback that we have currently had from groups who've been involved is that they want to continue to strengthen this advocacy work, and we will definitely be working with them to ensure that they're as skilled up and have all of the tools and resources to be able to increase this work as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Mandy, for letting us know about the Tibet group's increased engagement. And it was also so nice to witness numerous member states speak for Tibet, raising various human rights issues faced by the Tibetans in Tibet. Thank you so much, Mandy. Now, moving on to Carmen. Carmen, the UPR session on China that happened this January was the first one after this big, massive protest in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020, and also the introduction of the national security law. Could you share with us how your organization, the Hong Kong Democracy Council, and other Hong Kong human rights organizations worked together for this UPR session? Did you or other Hong Kong organizations connect with any organizations on this panel, or others that focus on human rights in China? What issues did you prioritize in your advocacy effort, and what are the positive takeaways for the Hong Kong community? Tell us your overall experience.
Thank you. And there are security issues of Hong Kongers who, for example, like us, we still have families back in Hong Kong. So somehow it would be really sensitive for us to do any kinds of advocacy for Hong Kong. And we have lots of anonymous activists or advocates working inside the UN mechanisms. And but we've been, so HADC is actually one of the really few that we have so many people who are willing to put our face on and put our real name when we are doing advocacy. And that is why we always work together, because somehow many of our friends and colleagues may not be really convenient to put their name, for example, just entering the UN buildings in Geneva it would be an obstacle for them. So we've been working closely, and we actually do have some collective efforts during the pre-session period of time for the UPR. We've been meeting delegates all together, and also to try to put together some collective recommendations that we may want the missions to make. And it was quite effective, because at the end of the day, there were 22 member states spoke about Hong Kong, and many of them, actually most of them, answered our call during the meetings with us. And of course, at the same time, we reach out to airlines and airlines organizations like Mandy and also Peter. I know my colleagues in Washington D.C. they work closely with UHRP as well, and also I've got I attend actually advocacy training session last summer, which was hosted by Isaac Chow, and then these sort of international NGOs, they have rich resources on providing training on us, and also providing us resources and networks, allowing us to to be more effective when we trying to do advocacy in Geneva. At the same time, we also try to reach out to the human rights departments in the capitals, also along with airlines organizations, for example, like UHRP or ITN in Washington D.C., or also other airlines that we may get to know during our other advocacy work. And for the issue we prioritize, is really simple. For this UPR session is straightforward as well, because everyone, I mean, almost everyone would know that the national security law is the cause of, is the main tool that the Hong Kong government used to conduct its human rights abuses. So it's simple and straightforward to main call repelling the national security law, and the other one would be tackling transnational repression, and also recognize like an official recognition of transnational repression, or the definition of transnational repression being made within the human rights councils. The Hong Kong diaspora is new, and we have, although it's new, we have around 200,000 of Hong Kong fleet just within these 4 years. So we've been facing transnational repression, all kinds of harassment and intimidation, not only the activists are facing, but also like protesters, or even just Hong Kong-raised people will face whenever we try to speak out politically, or whenever we try to speak out for Hong Kong. So transnational repression is really a major concern for the Hong Kong diaspora, and as well as our family back in Hong Kong. And that would be our priority as well. In regard to the positive takeaways, I would say during the UPR session, we got focused on back in the Hong Kong issue, and we got more and more countries who are willing to support the cause of Hong Kong democracy, and yeah, like it's out of our expectation that even those countries who are traditionally more subtle, like for example Switzerland and Japan, they also concerned about the national security law, and which is a thing that we are quite surprised. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carmen, and thank you so much for bringing out this really important topic on transnational repression. Isha Freedom Institute, we actually had a discussion on transnational repression. I think Peter was also one of our members then. Yeah, so we'll move on to our next two general questions, and I request our speakers to please keep it short. Let's not make it to 3 minutes now. Let's make it to 2 minutes, or maybe even less, because we are really running out of time. So without further ado, I'll just continue with the first general question of the third round. Okay, so Peter, the deposed Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang, in his remarks in the 52nd session of the UN Human Rights Council on February 27, 2023, stated that China will follow a Chinese path of human rights development that meets the trend of the times and suits its national national conditions. He encouraged countries to not copy the model of others, but rather choose their own path of human rights development. Does this stance, which implies that the concept of human rights as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a Western construct, represent a strategy by China to deflect criticism of its practices and to potentially reshape international human rights standards and mechanisms? How can the human rights community and the international community counter this disinformation and clearly affirm that human rights are universal? Peter.
Sure. I mean, in terms of development, let's take development. China likes to talk about how there's been lots of development and GDP growth in the Uyghur region. Well, we just don't know that if Uyghurs, for example, or other Turkic peoples are actually benefiting because we don't have the data. They don't release disaggregated data and income. And we've seen in the past that there's clear disparities in terms of the kinds of things that Uyghurs are benefiting from. Now, before there was such a scourge of forced labor, there was just rampant employment discrimination. Uyghurs just weren't being employed. There's lots of discrimination in employment. So if we want to talk about development, well, it has to be development for all. And there just simply isn't evidence that the region and the development has actually benefited the Uyghur population, unfortunately. So we need disaggregated data to even prove this. They don't provide it. In terms of what the international community can be doing, I think there needs to be consistency in terms of the approach, or it would benefit, I think, so-called Western states if they are more consistent in their approach to the council, if they do the things that we push for as well, like accept requesting or accept visits and special procedures, play a constructive role within the system. I think there's been a lot of questions about kind of the approach of certain governments when it comes to the conflict in Gaza at the moment. I think governments need to be consistent to be taken seriously, or more seriously when it comes to China, that if you just ignore that there are abuses in your own country or other places, or you're supporting other governments in a certain way, you're not going to be taken as seriously when it comes to your arguments when it comes to the kind of criticisms you make for China. That's not something that maybe civil society can do, but I think governments need to keep this in mind. There was a side event last week on Tibet that the Canadian government put on, and then the Canadian government, they talked about especially boarding schools in Tibet. And they were talking about the kinds of systems that Canada had to overcome as well, and they're still overcoming that. There's basically a boarding school system that existed in Canada up until the 90s, and there's a lot of issues there. I think Canada did well to come forward and say we had this problem. In some ways, we still have this problem, but we're really working hard to address it. We recognize the abuses, and we're taking strong steps to rectify the abuses. And China should be doing the same thing. And I think that's the kind of approach that actually is much more effective.
Thank you so much, Peter. Mandy, let's hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think I'll just concentrate very quickly on what can be done now. Where can we go with all of this? So obviously the UPR isn't the only process that we can use to affect change. Civil society, there's a wealth of UN tools that we can use, including hopefully forthcoming treaty body reviews that we're expecting, special procedures, briefings and communications, and really making sure that we're offering the information that we need for special procedures to act. And there's some really key areas alongside more state advocacy to press for governments to, firstly, for governments to follow up on the recommendations they've made to China. In the next Human Rights Council session, there will be an opportunity for China to say whether they have accepted recommendations. So states must be pressing China to accept the recommendation that they've made. Furthermore, states should be raising more item statements within the Human Rights Council. As Pete says, they should be sponsoring and co-sponsoring side events. They should be giving platforms to human rights defenders, so Tibetan human rights defenders, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, to make sure that the voices are really heard within the council forum. As we said earlier, they need to be pushing back against the reprisals. They need to make sure that China do not get away with harassing, human rights defenders who come to give evidence at the council. And passing legislation, so passing national legislation with sanctions against Chinese officials, against a whole stream of the offences that have been carried out, including the officials who are engaged in the forced assimilation of Tibetan children at the colonial boarding schools. There's a wealth of tools that we can use as civil society to be pressing our governments, to be pressing mechanisms within the UN forum, and we need to kind of make sure that we're skilled up and we are able to do that in a coordinated fashion.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Carmen, let's hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think I would just highlight one more point that that China is using, that we've observed from the legislation of the Article 23 recently, that China and of course the Hong Kong governments, they are using the narrative of putting anti China equal to anti-totalitarianism, and we, the human rights organizations, are being framed as anti-China organizations, where I think they use the same tactics in within the human rights councils as well, saying that using this kind of racism narrative to try to sweep away the human rights issues that are happening in China. And I think this is one of the quite concerning issue that member states and also as well as human rights organizations have to find creative ways to tackle. Of course, we don't have, apart from debunking them, we don't have like a really concrete solution on that at the moment. But then I do think that permanent missions in the UN should be aware of that and also try to counter this kind of narrative. Otherwise, it will the narrative inside the Human Rights Council or even within the UN will only be manipulated by China, I think, at least in the coming 5 to 10 years.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And I would like to quickly move on to the last question for today's discussion. Peter, it's likely that China won't provide a midterm report, right? Because the next UPR is in 2029, and China's term at the Human Rights Council ends in 2026. Excuse me. What strategies can your organizations and the broader human rights community do differently in preparation for the next UPR cycle to ensure effective action at the Human Rights Council? How can your work to prevent China from achieving its goal of removing long-standing practices of country-specific security, civil society participation, and independent monitoring mechanisms? What can you do? Like, what work can you do to prevent all this, Peter?
To be completely fair, I think I am not thinking so far ahead to the next UPR session already. I think some of the things that we've been speaking about already, Andy and Carmen just mentioned about the kinds of things that civil society should be doing. I think we should, of course, be doing those things. I think when the time comes, we'll have to reflect on the kinds of things that happen and what lessons we learned from this UPR session, which we're doing right now. But again, I think it's a little bit too far out because there's a lot of time in between where we need to be pushing for civil society access to ensure that the High Commissioner's Office keeps receiving information, that we're active in every single opportunity, every single treaty body, working with the UN experts and others to make sure that these kinds of issues are continuing to be raised, so that again we have another robust cycle of information that's not just society saying these things, but it's the UN system that's saying these things and making these recommendations. That, in short, I think would be my answer there.
Thank you, Peter. And Mandy, let's hear yours.
So just very quickly, we will likely, and this is no promise, we will likely be issuing our own midterm report. As you say, China won't be. They have never done before. It's not a legitimate requirement, but it is obviously something which would be really welcomed. But Tibet Advocacy Coalition will certainly be doing that, and I'm sure a number of our colleagues will as well. Another thing we'll be doing is we'll be updating our Human Rights Action Plan on Tibet. which is a way for states and other bodies to be able to monitor how China are adhering to the UPR recommendations, or any of the other kind of legal requirements with treaty bodies, etc. So they're some of the really simple things that we will be doing, and building on moving towards the next UPR. I'm in the same place as Pete. We're not really looking towards that yet. Who even knows whether there will be a next UPR cycle? We don't know whether the cycles will continue, because there is no specific plan for that yet. So it's a bit of a wait and see.
Thank you, Mandy. Carmen, let's hear your perspective.
As Peter said, it will be too far beyond our plan for now as well. We are there's a lot happening in Hong Kong, and we've been reacting day to day. So I think what I could tell is that HADC is we constantly updating our political prisoners database, which is a database that documented all the political prisoners in Hong Kong. And we also have reports coming up as well. And these are the things that these are the regular routine that we are doing right now. And I think for the Hong Kong community, apart from doing advocacy work, we are sort of focusing on community building as well within the diaspora, which is, I think, is quite important for us to do so, because we are new to the diaspora, and there is no historical lessons that we could learn in preserving our culture overseas and our own narrative overseas. So I think for long-term plan for human rights organization focusing on Hong Kong, there would be a lot of these initiatives happening in the future as well before the next UPR.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all our panelists for their contributions in today's discussion. And I must say that it is through such platforms that we can foster greater understanding and advocate for change, and ultimately strive towards a world where human rights are universally respected. I would also like to say that before I end this, I would also like to say that AFI recently published a document on the next Dalai Lama, and if you want to access this document, the publication can be downloaded on Asia Freedom Institute's website, and this is the picture of the document. This is the cover page. And before I end, I would like to say that the video of the session will be uploaded on Asia Freedom Institute's website. And I would like to request our panelists and all our viewers to please follow the social media pages of Asia Freedom Institute. And I would like to thank everyone, all our panelists, everyone who has been involved for today's discussion. I know everyone, you all have a very busy schedule, and I'm really grateful for every one of you for taking out your time to speak with Asia Freedom Institute. Thank you so much, everyone, and to all our viewers as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.